final playoff predictions. So to get you up to speed with where things are, I did these a month ago, and then I woke up like a week ago, and I was not happy with the predictions I put out a month ago. So I want you to scrap them, forget them, erase the Etch-a-Sketch in your memory, clean slate. This is what I'm going to war with. I have got Ohio State winning the Big Ten. I have got Texas winning the SEC. I have got Miami winning the ACC. And I've got Oklahoma State winning the Big 12. The reason I mentioned those conference champs is because they will have the top 4 seeds and therefore the first round byes. That's the order I've got them in. Ohio State, Texas, Miami, Oklahoma State. I've got those as your 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, in this world, in this 12-team playoff, remember how the bracket is structured. We do not reseed after every round. So it is guaranteed that Ohio State, as the 1 seed, they'll play the winner of 8 versus 9. Just keep that in mind, because that's going to be a really big talking point down the road. All right, so here's how the full bracket looks. I'm going to tell you the other teams I've got in this thing now. Oregon loses the Big Ten championship game. I've got him at 5. Bama loses the SEC championship game. I've got him at 6. FSU loses the ACC championship game. I've got him at 7. So the thinking here, and I don't know that this is the way it's going to be, but my thinking, and I think the way it's got to be for the committee to maintain any kind of, integrity, is they've got to reward teams that made the conference championship game. You can't have Oregon and Alabama losing that thing and then dropping below teams that didn't play in conference title weekend. So even though they got another loss on the resume, I don't think they're dropping very far. Georgia at number 8 is not a conference title loser, but I don't think the Big 12's conference title loser will get the same treatment. So I think those big 3 there, Oregon, Bama, FSU, that's 5, 6, and 7. I got Georgia at number 8 because I think Georgia's going to have a couple of losses on their resume that keep them from Atlanta, but those losses are probably going to be to either the teams that were in Atlanta or one of the 2 teams that was in Atlanta and like an Ole Miss. So Georgia's going to have a really strong resume. Number 9 through 12, I've got Penn State as a 9 seed. Penn State has a Penn State year where they drop 1 or 2 games to the big opponents. I've got them, I think, losing 1 of them this year. But by and large, they're a good team. I think the offense will be better, and they'll be a solid 9 seed. Ole Miss, I've got them in the playoff. Don't have them in the conference title game anymore. Got them in the playoff at number 10. Notre Dame I have as a 2-loss team. I think that'll be good enough to back them into the playoff as an 11 seed, and I am kicking Liberty out of this thing. I was listening to someone talk the other day, and it kind of dawned on me that not only does this committee need to send a message with rewarding you for playing for a conference title, they've got to send a message about strength of schedule. And there is no way that you guys need to be letting that Liberty team in there. I know that, Liberty fans, I know you guys tried to schedule some Power 4 teams, and they said no. And you're like, that's not our fault. Well, that's true, but it's not the committee's fault either. Like, we have to go on what we have to go on. So Memphis goes and plays FSU this year. I think there's a world where a 10-2 Memphis ends up being ranked over Liberty, and should be, because that's the disparity in strength of schedule. So there you go, Penn State, Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Memphis. That's 9, 10, 11, and 12. This is what that means the bracket would look like. And, brother, we got some matchups here. That means we get Georgia versus Penn State, and it would be Penn State at Georgia in round 1. We would have Memphis at Oregon in a body bagging, most likely. More on that in a second. We would have Ole Miss at FSU, so Rebels going down to Tallahassee for round 1. Weather figures to not be a factor there. It figures to be pretty comfortable, actually. And how about just going ahead and sending Notre Dame to Tuscaloosa for round 1? Now, there are going to be people in the comment section who say, oh, Mr. Anti-Playoff Expansion, you sound hypocritical. You sound like you're into these matchups. I am. I'm very into the matchups. Like I've told you repeatedly, the playoff as a product is going to be amazing. What we trade off to get there is not amazing, and that's a whole other conversation. So forget about that for now. If we're talking about the playoff, this is pretty incredible. Memphis at Oregon, Notre Dame at Alabama, Ole Miss at Florida State, Penn State at Georgia. I'm going to tell you right now who I'd take here. I'd take Oregon over Memphis. I would take Alabama over Notre Dame. I would take Ole Miss to go into Tallahassee and beat Florida State. And I would take Georgia over Penn State. So 3 of 4 home teams win there. That means you got 4 SEC teams in the quarterfinals. And something everyone's watching is that 12 versus 5. So there's a lot of debate right now. And the stat crowd would tell you one thing, and I think the gut feel crowd would tell you another thing. So if you listen to a data analyst, they will absolutely tell you, just unequivocally, there's no debate here. It always behooves you to get the number 1 seed and get a first round bye than it does to have to be the 5 seed and play one more game. Then there's another person who comes in, and Colin, could you do me a favor? Throw up the bracket you just threw up again. Because there's another person who would come in and they'd say, okay, I'll grant you, Oregon there is the 5 seed. Yeah, they would have to play one more game than Ohio State. But look at Oregon's draw. Oregon would play the FCS team, or the G5 team, Memphis in this case, could be someone else. They'd be solidly favored. They'd get them at home. They'd win the game. They'd play them. Then they'd get the lowest ranked bye team, which is probably the Big 12 team. So you ask yourself, would you rather be Ohio State and have to play Georgia one time, or would you rather be Oregon and play a G5 team and then a Big 12 team? Some years, I think it may be a wash. Some years, in fact, many years, maybe it makes sense to have the bye. But if you're just telling me the totality of playing one more game is what disproportionately tilts it, I'm going to tell you, case by case, you may be wrong on that. And I'm going to tell you right now, if Liberty's in that spot instead of Memphis, for example, you absolutely give me Oregon's draw. I'll absolutely take one more game playing it at home. I don't care what the data says, because I know why that data says what it says. The biggest risk to me here is added risk of injury. I'm going to accept it, and I'm going to take on Liberty or Memphis, and then I'm going to happily take on the Big 12 champ over having to play Georgia in round 2, or a team that beat Georgia. So anyway, that's a side conversation, but it will be a main piece of the conversation come playoff time. So let's move on. Now, I just filled that in. Here's where I've got us going. After Georgia beats Penn State, after Oregon beats Memphis, after Ole Miss beats FSU, after Bama beats Notre Dame, that gives us our next round, and that is Ohio State versus Georgia. Now, keep in mind, because we can't have too many nice things in this sport, none of the rest of these games are at home. They're all on neutral sites because folks who really don't care about you much have to make their money. Ohio State versus Georgia is a national championship game, basically, just like it was a couple of years ago in the semifinal game. We've got Oregon against Oklahoma State. I would have Texas versus Ole Miss here. I'd have Bama versus Miami here. I am going to take, in this order, Ohio State over Georgia. I would take Oregon over Oklahoma State. I would take Texas over Ole Miss. And I would take Alabama over Miami. If that's real, those are some heavy hitter matchups. That is a heavy-duty lineup of games there. And honestly, where's your biggest upset? Oklahoma State, if they beat Oregon, because it's the Big 12 over the Big 10, I think fairly sizable. If Miami were to take down Bama, watching that personnel, man, would be fascinating. But Ohio State, Georgia is like a main event national title level game that's happening in the quarterfinal. So again, you lock down that 1 seed at your own peril. You're going to be playing someone good. That 1 seed he's going to be rested, but he's going to be playing someone good out the gate. Okay, now let's go to the semifinals. Your Final Four. Let's just say it pans out this way, friends. Your Final Four, according to my bracket, is Ohio State versus Oregon and Texas versus Alabama. Now, Josh, that sounds familiar. It is, because that's a rematch of your Big Ten title game, and that's a rematch of your SEC championship game. And since I don't think there's any skill in changing your pick here, aside from flipping a coin, if I took Ohio State against Oregon on a neutral field a few weeks earlier, I'll take Ohio State again. If I took Texas over Alabama on a neutral field a few weeks earlier, I'll take Texas over Alabama again, which would mean I've got Texas versus Ohio State in the national championship game, just like I did a month ago in my predictions. That hasn't changed. And just like I had a month ago, I don't think I'm going to change my pick. So I'm going to take Ohio State over Texas to win the national championship. Now, as the pretend confetti rains down over me, a couple of questions here. let's just say it were to play out like this. What does the rematch crowd say? There was a crowd that did not like that we had rematches like in 2011 in the BCS game, or in 21. You had the SEC title game, and then Georgia, Bama, right there in Indy again a month later for the national title, and we need to expand the playoff. Well, what would the rematch crowd say if an expanded playoff just led to more of the same that you had seen a month earlier? Number two, and this is the more important conversation, would this lead anyone, or here's a better question, will the way the playoff plays out this year lead anyone in a position of power to rethink the bye structure? Because the bye structure is garbage in this format. I was listening to our buddies over at College Football Nerds talk earlier today. They're right. They always nail this kind of stuff. Like, I go full ADD on this. I lose my attention span when we're talking about brackets and rules and stuff like that. But even I get this one. This is messed up. And what's going to end up happening is you're going to have people like me who say there should be no guarantee that those buys are reserved for conference champs. You should just take the best 12, and I don't even want auto bids, period. But keep your G5 auto bid if you need to, but just let the best 4 have the buys. But then I know what the counter is. You don't have to yell at me. The counter is, well, if you do that, you take away the motivation and incentive to win the conference championship, and you've got to maintain the sanctity of the conference championship. To which I say, look at this piece of paper. I've got 2 rematches of conference title games happening a month later. So given this scenario, what integrity of conference titles did we maintain if you go and play it and risk injury in doing so in Atlanta and Indianapolis, and then a month later you're just playing each other again anyway? And by the way, you're not guaranteed to have the same winner in those games. So not only is the value of it deteriorated, the sanctity of the outcome may be deteriorated. Oh, by the way, one of these matchups features teams playing for the 3rd time in a given year. So is there a debate about that? Can't know, because it's the first time we've been around this merry-go-round, so we can't really know what it's going to sound like. But that's what I got right now. I got Ohio State versus Texas. The Big Ten's best and the SEC's best, shocker, is what I think the matchup will be in the national title game. And I'll go with the Buckeyes. And let me remind you, Colin, keep that up for just a second, immunity. Let me just remind you, if this were to happen, okay, I want you to think about the Ryan Day roller coaster here. If this plays out, presumably, you just watched Ohio State beat Michigan, then beat Oregon, then beat Georgia, then beat Oregon again, and then beat Texas. By my count, Mr. Can't Win the Big Game wins 5 of them in a row. And what are you saying about Ryan Day then? Well, because I know what I'm doing. I'm having Colin and Jesse cut up the 37 times that we told you he eventually would. So that's what I would do. Some of you guys need to find a hole to dig and crawl in. If he were to do this, if he goes on this run, whew, now, if he loses to Michigan for a 4th consecutive year, you reserve the right to throw this footage back in my face, and all's fair in that case. So there's my national champ. The Ohio State Buckeyes, my national champ.